call your name, you're just announcing that you're present where you are, and we'll do that the minutes at the same time. So, so you'll give us a yes or no on the minutes at that point.
Amy, there's a shadow above Tim's head.
Call your name, you're just announcing that. Whoa.
The webinar is now streamlining live on YouTube.
All right.
There it is. It's gone.
All right, we should be good to go, Richard, whenever you're ready.
All right, folks. Rockingham Planning Commission, Wednesday, May 12, remote meeting via Zoom. Per RSA 91-A:2, Roman numeral 3, B in parentheses, the RPC chair has declared the COVID-19 outbreak an emergency and has waived the requirement that a quorum be physically present at the meeting. Could I hear a motion on the minutes?
So moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Andrew did a second. Okay,
Okay.
Tim.
Yeah, Richard,
Here, I'm not alone,
can you approve the minutes?
and I approve the minutes. My apologies.
Thank you. Glenn Koppelman,
Present alone and yes on the minutes.
Jim Doggett,
He's here.
I think we lost him.
looks like we lost Jim. That's who disappeared. Okay.
Yep.
All right, so we lost him, and then Mary Allen was with him. So Barbara Kravitz,
I'm here alone and yes on the minutes.
Al Davis,
Yes, I'm here alone and yes on the minutes.
Peter Coffin,
Home alone, yes on minutes.
Beth Morrow,
I am at home in a room by myself and yes on the minutes.
all right, Peter Britz,
I'm at my home in a room by myself and a yes on the minutes.
all right, Andrew Brubaker,
Present, home, in a room by myself, yes on the minutes.
and Gwen English.
I am here and I am alone in the room and yes on the minutes.
All right, Mike McAndrew,
I'm home alone and yes on the minutes.
Phil Winslow,
Yeah, home office, yes on minutes.
all right, Dennis Hebert,
Home alone and yes on the minutes.
Leanne Miner,
Here alone and yes on the minutes.
all right, and Lucy Cushman,
Home alone, yes on the minutes.
and Valerie Gamache.
Excuse me. Here alone, a yes on the minutes.
Okay, that's everyone. We'll see if Jim Doggett comes back in. So, but
Okay.
so far he hasn't.
Tim, would you mind taking the committee reports and starting with the executive committee?
Not at all, Richard. So executive committee, we talked about initially some of the COVID operations at the RPC. Also, this whole issue with remote meeting. At the time, a couple of weeks ago, the expectation that this will continue for us for a while. As an organization, at least the executive committee's feeling was, given the option, we'll continue to meet remotely through our June annual meeting. Sort of figure out the summer as we go. We usually take 1 month off. We sometimes take both July and August off, depending on how busy things are. And then the expectation or the hope was that we could potentially regroup in person in September. So unless we're forced into it by some other direction at the state level and in 91A, that's sort of the expectation that we're taking, was to try to get the June meeting remotely and then work through the 2 summer months, depending on workload, and then likely or hopefully regroup in person in September. But I think the opinion of the executive committee was that, the convenience of remote and Zoom, particularly in the winter months when weather turns bad, we want to still have that option, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. Let's see, we also talked about the 501c3. Thanks to Beth Morrow, we have a set of bylaws that look really good for the size of the organization. We discussed those. We had a few comments that we put together, and we're hoping to convene the sort of the board of the 501c3, which is effectively the executive committee this month, concurrent with the executive committee, get those bylaws adopted, and then move forward with the remainder of the work to incorporate the 501c3 through the New Hampshire state requirements and then the IRS requirements that remain out there. So this summer, I hope we have this fully incorporated and we can begin using it to our advantage and start, chasing down some grants to support the communities and support the Planning Commission. We also looked at the fiscal 22 budget. We took a second look at that. I'm just giving you all a heads up because you'll be seeing this in June. You'll have a recommendation from the executive committee in June for the budget. Right now, it looks pretty good. It looks to be a positive balance with a little bit of surplus. One grant that's hanging out there would be the Tufts Health Plan grant, which is for age-friendly communities work and age-friendly planning. If that comes through, that's going to put us in a really comfortable position. Excuse me one second. Sorry, I'm at home. I was back in the office, but I'm at home tonight and I have kids running around screaming. So anyway, so the budget looks pretty good right now. And like I said, should the Tufts grant come through, we're going to be in much better shape even than we are right now. So, and then the other items we discussed was, if you haven't heard already, Plastow did not renew their membership with the RPC. In a nutshell, what happened was we were added to their budget. The planning board recommended us in their budget. We were in the budget that was moved forward by the budget committee. Something happened between budget committee and the select board making their decision. The town manager needed to cut $110,000 out of the budget, basically, $110,000 out of a $10 million budget, and we were part of that cut. As most of you know, Tim Moore is a longtime commissioner, had no advance notice, was pretty upset by it. I've tried to connect with Tim to figure out some strategies to get back with Plastow. We're still working on that. And I've also talked to Julian Kiska, who's our other commissioner. And we're still trying to figure out if we can get them to reverse that decision. Basically it's a $7,000 line item in a $10 million budget. It's really not a lot. So, the impact for the rest of us is that's, $7,000 less in dues. That means I use a little bit more of each of your monies, each of your dues to go ahead and, make sure that we can meet our commitments to the DOT and others for match. So it's unfortunate, but we're going to continue working to get them back. And then the last thing we discussed was the regional housing needs assessment that we need to do. There's an administrative error in what we published in 2015. We just had a motion by the executive committee to make a correction to that. Basically took a draft stamp off of a table that shouldn't have had a draft listed on it. It was a final document. We just made that correction. So it was a busy meeting. It was a full meeting, but that's really the gist of it. So if there's any questions on that, be happy to take them.
Don't everybody jump at once.
All right, not seeing anything. So I'll move on then to the nominating committee.
If you would, please.
Yeah, sent you a couple emails on this. Per our bylaws, we're required to, give you 30 days to review the proposed slate of officers for the next fiscal year, for fiscal 22, as well as any opportunities or vacancies on the executive committee. So I put that forward to you in a memo. both in your packet here as well as in a separate email. But essentially, the nominating committee met on a couple of occasions, March and April, to look at what we had for the slate and look at the openings on the executive committee. And we put forward a slate of officers, which is really unchanged from the current fiscal year, that being Richard McDermott as our chair, Al Davis as our vice chair, Mike Terrell continuing as treasurer, Glenn Koppelman as secretary, and Barbara Kravitz as past chair. Then in terms of the executive committee, the membership is a little bit different in that we had a couple vacancies. We lost Tim Moore because of the Plastow departure, and also in Northampton, Phil Winslow did not renew, and we picked up Valerie Gamache as a new commissioner, but that left a separate vacancy on our executive committee. So since then, I've reached out to a few folks. Some were available, some were not.
Tim,
Then-
Phil Wilson, Tim,
What's that?
it was Phil Wilson. When's
Yeah,
last year?
Did I say the wrong name?
And Phil didn't say a word.
Yeah.
I said Phil Winslow.
Oh, did I? Sorry.
It's okay. It's just like a verbal typo.
It is. And Phil's here, so I probably was looking at his name.
Did you hear Valerie?
At any rate, we were basically down to two at-large members. Through some phone calls, some requests, some canvassing, Dennis Hebert was willing to step up and be nominated as an at-large member. And I did, in fact, reach out to Phil Winslow to be an at-large member to replace Phil Wilson. Phil had to decline. Phil Winslow had to decline. This isn't easy. Phil Winslow had to decline,
He's loving this.
leaving us with one vacancy at this point, heading into our annual meeting in June. So we will be accepting nominations from the floor should anyone want to step up and be nominated as an executive committee member between now and our June meeting. There is the possibility of Christina McCarthy returning from Raymond as a commissioner and executive committee member. She was on the executive committee in the past and was a commissioner in the past. Still working on that channel, but that's a possibility where she could potentially fill out our roster. So in a nutshell, at the very least, this is the slate and the executive committee memberships you'll be voting on in June. And should we get any other nominations at our June meeting, we'll be replacing that vacancy with whoever comes forward.
Can we make sure there's no more Phils?
No more Phil W's. All right, so that's essentially where the nominating committee stands, what you'll be looking at as a commission on June 9th or 10th, whenever our meeting is. Does that sound good? Everyone with me?
Yes.
Yes.
It's June 9th.
Does anyone want to step up tonight? No? Anyone? But you have time, so think about that and we'll go from there. So
Awful quiet.
that's all right. Like I said, I think we've got potential out there, so I'll continue to work with our friends from Salem and Raymond and see if we can get somebody on board. So, all right.
Tim, this is Dennis Hebert. I have a question for you. If Plastow just doesn't pay their dues, does that mean they're no longer a member of the RP? Is that the rules? Is that the bylaws?
Yeah, effectively, they're not renewing their membership as it's voluntary, Dennis, as you understand. And, it's one of those things that, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess if you don't pay, you don't play. I guess that's what I didn't know what the dues really represented, and that it's a sort of a requirement. Otherwise, everyone could just join and not pay any dues.
Right. Well, that's basically it. And I'm not supporting Plastow with planning services moving forward. You know, and the sticking point is really the DOT side, because as most of you know, I use about half of everybody's dues to match the DOT grant. Plastow has 3 significant projects in the works that I know at least Dave Walker is working on one of them actively with the DOT to make sure that the public involvement process moves forward, that it continues to move forward in the transportation planning process. You know, effectively, they're not paying the match to support Dave's hours to do that work. So I find myself in a position where, you know, I'd like to stop the staff from working on that project, and effectively not support those projects moving forward in the planning process. And that's, you know, that's really what happens. That's the biggest sort of stick I have instead of a carrot. But I'd like to lay some carrots out there for them too, to come back and say, hey, you know, there's a whole lot that you're all going to hear a whole lot of work on source water protection that's happening in the RPC tonight. You're going to hear from Julie and Jen. And Plastow is a town that needs help with water, as is Hampstead.
Wow.
And, you know, this is some of the work that they're not supporting by backing out. And it's not a really easy thing to, you know, it's not a widget. We don't sell them a widget, but we sell them a service that can benefit them if they participate, and their voice should be heard on a lot of these issues. So that's sort of where it stands.
Thank you.
Yep. So speaking of that, Richard, I can segue from there if you want.
Well, I was waiting for everybody to stop asking their questions.
All right.
The legislative forum, please.
Oh, legislative committee. I'm sorry. I overlooked.
Tim's not here to speak up, so I was waiting for the other Tim.
Yeah, no, I know Jackie's here, but also there wasn't a whole lot of activity. Barbara and Jackie here from legislative committee, but I know the one thing that we did do was we did comment in support of SB 95 for the continuation of remote meetings, which we've already talked about a couple times.
Yeah.
I don't know if there were any other actionable items.
Barbara, can you add any credence?
Barbara or Jackie.
Barbara?
You got me. I'm blanking right now. I think there were 2. One was remote meetings. Jackie, do you remember what the other one was? You probably do.
I couldn't go to that meeting because I was in a hearing myself.
Yeah.
But we're tracking about 6 Senate bills and 2 House bills that have to do with municipal control or remote meetings, or there's a lot of executive orders that are being codified. So we're trying to keep track of what that will do to our town. To me, I think just sent. Oh, I think this is okay. This is a chat that has nothing to do with. Sorry. So that's where we are. I'm sorry, I don't have any other information, but what I can do is I did talk with Scott Bogle today, and the next meeting is going to be on the Wednesday, a week from today, actually. And I can send to Tim, who can circulate to all of you what the position is, and if any of these bills have actually passed through the Senate. I know the governor signed 14 bills this week, but I don't know, I can't remember what they are. I mean, I don't know what they are. I know what they are, but I don't know exactly how they're going to impact communities at all, if at all. So I can start that dialogue through Tim with you.
Jackie, is the 26th the firm date that you're talking about? A week from today?
You mean the 18th? Yes, the 18th is a firm date. Well, Scott's going to come for the legislative committee.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 18th.
A point of information, the 18th, I think,
Is it Tuesday?
it's going to be the 19th, isn't it?
19th, Jackie.
Oh, wait,
You're talking about Wednesday.
Okay, just a second. Let me look at my calendar. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. Wednesday the 19th. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anything else, Barbara?
I would just, following some of Tim's earlier remarks, Tim Moore was serving as the chair, so this is something to come up the next time I think the legislative committee meets.
I mean, technically, they're not gone until, Plastow is still a member till the end of the fiscal year. That's when the, would technically expire, but both Tim and Julian have sort of stepped aside immediately. I think, Tim's put a lot of his life and effort into this commission, and it's really unfortunate. I will tell you that the Plastow Board of Selectmen did reach out to me and say their intention is to come back next year once they get past this budget issue. I'm also trying to find out if the CARES Act funding that is distributing money to communities that were hurt by COVID might help offset this. So that's another avenue that we're working on with Plastow. So there's a lot of moving parts. I'll try to keep you posted. Julie noted in the chat, if you didn't see that, it's a good point that a lot of there's a lot of other areas, the targeted block grant funds, and other state and federal funds that we can help, help folks apply for. We're not going to be able to do that. We're not going to be able to help them. And, if this 501, when this 501 comes online, if we're able to access other funds to work with communities, it's just another area where they're going to miss out.
Yep.
It's small potatoes. We don't ask a lot in terms of dues. I realize budgets are tight and we try to be there for everybody and make sure that we provide a service, and just it's a hard thing that when budgets get tight, it's an easy thing to cut.
Tim, tongue in cheek, we have a budget as well.
I know. So we'll keep you posted, and we'll let you know as I learn more, and I'll keep you informed with what's going on with Plastow.
All right, we've got the RPC.
Can I just add one thing, to comment that Scott Bogle has been acting as staffing for the committee, and that's been a big help. He's been real good at that.
Doing a great job.
Anything else, Barb? Barbara, anything else?
My comment was that Scott Bogle has been serving as the chair as the staff for the committee, for the legislative committee, and he's doing a great job, and it's a big help.
Okay. Source water protection presentations, Julie and Jennifer. Julie's first, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Julie. I'll let you take away. You can introduce yourself. And the only thing I'll say at the top of this is, we talked earlier in the year about bringing forward, an update on what we've been doing with source water. I think this will be a couple of great presentations. And we also have Pat Bushway here from the Seacoast Long-Term Drinking Water Commission to fill us in on that. So Julie, you take it away. I'll let you segue over to Jen when you're done. And I'll let you decide if you want to take questions on the fly or at the end.
I'd be happy to take questions whenever anyone wants to raise their hand or ask a question at any point in time. So can I share my screen now?
Oh,
may.
You're the
Okay,
boss.
great. Thank you. Here we go. Here we go. So I need to minimize my screen a little bit here because I can't see half of my slides because I see everyone else talking. Thanks everyone for having me tonight. I'm gonna just, there we go, minimize my screen. So thanks so much. It's been a long time since I've seen and talked with any of you. And it's so nice to see your faces and hear your voices and hear you all acting on behalf of the RPC. Thank you. So I'm here tonight to talk about the model drinking water buffer regulation project that we're working on. And this is just a first slide. Here's our, you can show my screen. Here's our graphic that we produced for the project, which is like a little bit of a branding thing. And then just a great photograph of what actual vegetated buffer looks like, ideally. So we'll go on to the next slide. So I wanted to recognize our partners. Our partners are the Stratford Regional Planning Commission, who are partnering with us on this project and doing outreach and education and providing, creating some educational outreach materials for us as part of the project. And also our grant funders who is the Department of Environmental Services through the Drinking Water Bureau grant that funded this project. So moving along, so just kind of like just sort of going off, I think a lot of you probably already know this stuff, but just a primer on what a buffer actually looks like. So a buffer, excuse me, provides many functions with respect to water quality. We're looking at drinking water sources. Here is the primary goal for this model regulation. And so we're looking at drinking water sources, which are typically rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, other surface water sources. And so we look at buffers, we look to buffers to provide things like groundwater recharge, nutrient reduction, reducing pollution, reducing erosion control, and other types of what we call non-point source pollution, sources of pollution, like stormwater being one of those. So this buffer sort of talks about the whole sort of, I think all the functions that buffers provide. So part of it is what we call all the vegetation that occurs in the buffer, whether it's a forested buffer, a shrub buffer, a meadow, or meadow grass or shrubs or whatever, provide buffering capacity to absorb pollutants, to stop the input of things like sediments and other types of pollutants that could go into a water body that could serve as a drinking water source. So buffers are oftentimes thought about as more of like a habitat and wildlife buffer, but we're talking about this regulation as being geared more towards and focused towards drinking water. So how can we prevent pollutants from entering the drinking water supply from a surface water source? So that's what this buffer, this graphic's all about. So just moving forward, sort of reviewing the elements of the model. What we're doing is we're developing a statewide model regulation, which is really different than something we've done before, which I think we just talked about this before a little bit in the context of towns that contribute to our regional planning commission. This is a project that was sponsored by the Drinking Water Bureau to be a statewide model for drinking water protection, because no protection actually or a model doesn't exist, from a statewide perspective. So we're looking at the model to be a statewide drinking water model, which is a little bit beyond typically our scope of what we typically, work within. And we're reaching out to lots of partners in the state, including the Association of Conservation Commissions, all the other regional planning commissions as well, and trying to get a real statewide perspective on what a drinking water model would look and feel like. So the elements of the model regulation are kind of 5 or 6 different points. So there's an introduction to the model. There's a statewide applicability that does apply statewide to any drinking water or source that would provide drinking water for a community or a community well or any kind of drinking water supply. There's a purpose and goals section. There's a rationale and a legal basis. And so the purpose and goals are super important. And whenever I work with communities and looking at zoning ordinance changes or regulation changes, is to really provide a clear definition of what the purpose is, what the goals are. So what do you want to attain by adopting this ordinance or regulation? And then the rationale for doing it, which is, typically providing for public health and safety. And the legal basis actually lies, well, I'll talk about that in a little bit, in the statutes, the state statutes actually to actually adopt environmental protections that protect the health and safety of the community. Then I'll quickly go through the municipal methods for adoption, like the different ways that communities can actually adopt these types of protections. Key criteria for including the buffer width. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then additional criteria for expansion of the buffer, and then some technical resources. So kind of moving along. So the introduction is the statewide applicability, basically, of the model buffer or regulation, and that it can apply to any drinking water supply source that in the state. And typically these are more surface water oriented sources, not so much groundwater wells, which have a whole different sort of permitting and regulatory component around them. But most it's like surface water. So we're talking about lakes, ponds, streams, rivers probably in most cases. And quite a few of our communities actually derive water from surface water sources. So Portsmouth gets their drinking water from the Bellamy Reservoir, which is located in Madbury, New Hampshire, and the Exeter River supplies water to some portions of the town of Exeter as well. So there are some surface water sources in the coastal New Hampshire that would be relevant to this regulation. So the second point is to the legal basis of this is that it relies on RSA 674:21. And those are all those little books you get every year, like with a different color. I think this year they're like a light tan color. And 674:21 is the innovative land use controls. And that includes environmental characteristics zoning and anything that requires some sort of environmental oversight. And it also allows for a planning board conditional use permit to be part of that permission or that approval process, which means that the planning board would be the overseer of the permit to initiate some sort of buffer control around drinking water sources. So that's really a little bit different than what most communities do, and that the zoning board doesn't really have control over the approval of such controls. It's the planning board that issues the conditional use permit, and there, as part of that permit, there can be a lot of criteria, and like we talked about, the purpose and goals, like what you want to achieve as far as drinking water, so water quality protection and everything that entails. And I'll be talking about that a little bit in the future. And the third point is that New Hampshire doesn't really have a uniform buffer for drinking water supplies and sources. So that's the reason why the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Drinking Water Bureau wanted to prepare some sort of statewide model that could be used uniformly across the state. And like I said, this is something we typically don't do, is like a statewide sort of project, but this is one that does apply in that category. There are other statewide protections that provide for water and groundwater resource protection, but mostly they are focused on groundwater, not surface water. So groundwater withdrawals, such as community wells or commercial wells or things of that nature, commercial water suppliers, for example. And there are prohibited land uses within those drinking water supply watersheds that are defined around those water wells. But that's about the limit of drinking water protections. So this surface water protection model is sort of a little bit, I would say, kind of groundbreaking in a lot of ways, and that it's sort of looking at things in a little bit more detail and trying to provide some guidance to communities who want to put online a surface water supply in the future. So let's see, hang on. I think sorry, I'm just sort of, paging through my slides here. So there are two ways that communities can actually adopt a surface water, a drinking water buffer regulation. So one is to adopt it in zoning. And zoning requires a warrant article to be voted on at town meeting or by a town or city council per RSA chapter 675. So there's a little bit more of a process that's involved with putting a drinking water buffer regulation up for vote in a zoning ordinance or a zoning context. However, the benefit of doing that is that all development moving forward after that ordinance is actually passed and adopted by the community, whether it's a town or a city council, is that all development activity would be subject to that ordinance moving forward. So it sort of resets the clock basically, and basically says all development moving forward within whatever buffer that's required for a drinking water supply would be subject to this ordinance. So there's a little bit more heft with respect to a zoning ordinance. And then the other option is for planning boards to adopt site plan review and subdivision regulations that include buffer protections for surface water supplies. And this only requires a public hearing by the planning board, and it doesn't require a town vote. So it's a slightly lighter lift. However, one of the restrictions on it is that it would only apply to new development or redevelopment or multifamily development and subdivision of land. So it has a limited scope. It doesn't mean that everything that happens on the landscape would be subject to the new regulation. It would be a limited scope to whatever comes before the planning board as an application. So the two are very different. They have a different adoption process, and they have a different jurisdiction basically. So zoning is more comprehensive. It requires application to everything that happens on the landscape. Site plan and subdivision would only be things that happen or occur where an application to the planning board is required. So very different jurisdictions between those two different adoption processes. So just kind of moving on, and actually anybody who has a question, please just chime in and ask a question. I'm happy to answer any questions anytime. So the model drinking water regulation.
Sorry to interrupt, Julie. It looks like Dennis Heber has a question.
Okay, sorry, I can't see them because I'm looking at my slides.
Sorry. Okay, sorry.
Hey, Dennis, how you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
A question I have, you mentioned the example of Portsmouth having a reservoir in another town. How does the planning board in Portsmouth or does the town of Portsmouth either go with either process for Madbury?
I don't know all the details. I know Peter Briss is on the call tonight, so maybe he could probably chime in a little bit more. But I know that Portsmouth has had a concerted effort to conserve a lot of the land around the reservoir itself to protect it from any kind of water quality, contamination. So I know that the city of Portsmouth has done a lot towards that.
I'm sure they have. I just didn't know how you could. And it was just a question that I had, if anyone had given that any thought, because it's one town tying up land in another, and maybe we don't have the answer tonight. It was just a thought. Thank you.
Peter, do you have any comments about that?
No, I guess I would say that it would be up to the town to set their own ordinances or their site review regulations. So we might try to move for that, but I think that's part of the reason why protecting the land around the reservoir has been an active initiative of the city to protect that water body.
Right. They've been trying to buy up some of the lots that are all around it.
Yeah, they have. That's true. Thank you for that's actually a great question. Because that's one of the strategies actually for drinking water regulation is not just, providing a buffer, but really encouraging land conservation in the watershed as a whole, the contributing watershed, but also the surrounding lands to protect them so that that there are not adverse impacts resulting from land uses that are adjacent to the water body. And there are great examples actually in the model. We'll call out some of those. One of those is the Quabbin Reservoir in Boston, in Western Massachusetts. Way out in Western Mass, there's the Quabbin Reservoir supplies water to drinking water to the city of Boston. And they have over time protected vast amounts of acres around that water in the watershed and around the reservoir to protect the water quality. And that's it's probably one of the best, most effective ways of protecting water quality for a drinking water source like that, especially a surface water source like a reservoir or a pond or lake, excuse me. However, it can be costly, and there's lots of, excuse me, negotiation with property owners that have to happen to make that happen. So it's not an easy process.
Julie, looks like we have another question from Richard.
Okay.
Julie, on that reservoir that you're talking about, are there any parameters as to the distance from the reservoir in or out, I should say?
I don't know the particulars of, you're talking about Portsmouth and the Bellamy Reservoir?
Yes.
I don't know the specifics of that, so I can't speak to that today. But
So Dover or Madbury versus Portsmouth, neither one chimes in relative to the setbacks?
well, it would be the local requirements that would be applied to that reservoir. So whatever the local
Regardless of what Portsmouth wants.
right, exactly.
Okay.
But they have acquired that as a drinking water source, so they must own some of the property around it. I'm not sure how far around it they actually own, but they actually own or control the water source, but they don't necessarily control the land uses around the water source.
Yeah, okay.
So that is a super good question, and that's if a town is thinking about bringing a water source online, they have to start thinking about some of these questions.
Sure.
And I know that, just as an anecdotal thing, I don't want to get too far down the weeds here, but I know that the city of Rochester cited a new well very close to the Kashiko River, in the floodplain of the Kashiko River years ago. And they bought a huge piece of property. They used to be a campground, actually, to site their water well on, so that they could have control over the land uses around it and make sure that the land uses around that water well were protected. So there are anecdotal, there are instances where communities have really stepped up to the plate and to protect their water supply. So surface water sources are a little bit, what's the word? Squishy is the first word that comes to my mind right now, but because it does require land conservation and land protection around the water source to protect it. And that is, if you're putting something online after the fact, and there's already development in the watershed and in around the buffers around the water supply, then it's actually a little bit more hard to get a handle on. One example is actually Lake Winnipesaukee, where there are lots of controls around the Shoreland Protection Act and others that protect but that's a water supply, but most people can't drink it. They have to treat it before they drink it. But it is a water supply for a lot of properties that surround Lake Winnipesaukee. But basically it's a boil only thing. You can wash your dishes in it, but you can't cook or eat it or drink it. So sorry, that's kind of a long explanation. So let's move on, and I only have a couple more slides, so let's just kind of move on, and please note your questions, and let's talk about your questions at the end. I would love to have a further conversation about it. So the model regulation talks about applying that only applies to surface waters used as a drinking water source. So it's not groundwater wells. It doesn't apply to anything except for a surface water supply. So that's a lake, a pond, a river that provides drinking water to community. And There are provisions in the model that will talk about expanding the protections to the watershed scale, and also including any kind of contributing drainage that supplies that source with water. So any stream, river, tributary that flows into that water source, meaning some sort of reservoir of some sort, like a lake, pond, reservoir, or whatever it is, and expanding the protection criteria to all the contributing drainage sources within that contributing area. So that would be basically the watershed scale area that would supply that water body with water. And that could be fairly substantial in some cases. The model recommends a 100-foot drinking water quality protection buffer. It's documented in lots of scientific studies across the country, and actually also studies that have been done here in New England and also in New Hampshire, that 100 feet is like a minimum for protecting drinking water quality. So a minimum buffer. So that buffer means, and what buffer actually means in this context, is a vegetated buffer, a non-disturbed area, somewhere where no development, no alteration of the landscape surface, no disturbance whatsoever happens within that 100 feet around the drinking water source. And then the model source goes on a little bit further, because there are some things that on the landscape scale that could really impact water quality. And there are considerations of additional criteria to expand that minimum buffer based on certain conditions that actually happen on the landscape. So I'll go on and talk about those next. So those things are things like, so landscape level conditions or characteristics that actually happen. So if we have, kind of picture in your head a water body with a 100-foot buffer, but if there are features that expand beyond that buffer that could, be detrimental to water quality, then you expand the buffer beyond to encompass those features. And those features are things like very poorly drained soils. So where runoff could happen very frequently, highly erodible soils, and areas of active erosion that are happening around the water body itself. So if there are, active areas of erosion that need to be mitigated, or in some case, like restored in some way, so that they're not contributing sediments and other types of nutrients from soils into the water body. Other landscape features include things like steep slopes, so greater than 20%, which is pretty steep actually. So if you have steep slopes that come down to a water body, you need to really expand the buffer, the 100-foot buffer, up to the top of the slope. And then what we're recommending for any one of these features is like go 20 feet beyond that feature, beyond. So you have the 100-foot buffer plus whatever feature you're looking at in your mapping around the water body, plus 20 feet to give yourself a little bit of some wiggle room to do some work, or at least provide an additional buffer around the water body. Another element for expansion criteria is unmanaged stormwater. In lots of areas, especially if there are steep slopes or any of one of the three above mentioned criteria or characteristics, where unmanaged stormwater just could really wreak havoc on water quality. It can bring in sediment, it can bring in nutrients, it can bring in, contaminants and anything else that you can possibly think of, from a petroleum residue from a, road runoff, or any other kind of chemical constituents from unmanaged stormwater from any number of sources. So basically it's sort of a point source and a non-point source, that it's water that just sort of goes unmanaged across the landscape, or from a very distinct location like a road, or an impervious surface like a parking lot or something like that. The last part of the expansion criteria looks at high value aquatic habitat, because unlike just general wildlife habitat in any situation for a drinking water source, aquatic habitat really has a high value with respect to maintaining water quality in the water body itself. So they add oxygen, they eat bed bugs, they do all sorts of, they actually function in lots of ways that help maintain the high value or the high quality of water within that water habitat. So high value aquatic habitat is one of the things we look at, not so much what happens outside in the buffer, which is obviously very important, and it's something that we talk about all the time and consider a lot as far as buffer habitat, but the aquatic habitat, the in-water habitat is really super important to maintaining the quality of water within a drinking water source. So I'm going to pause for a moment and ask if anyone has any questions. That's sort of a very quick and dirty overview of what the model looks like. I have a couple more slides to present, and then, but if anyone has any questions about it, this is a model that's probably has limited application because there aren't that many, probably too many communities that will bring on a surface water source as a drinking water supply source, but it's not impossible. And it's certainly something that's probably plausible in the future, given, climate change and drought and, everything else we're facing as far as, compromised water supplies, that some communities, especially those that have a lot of surface waters that are of high quality already, may come online as a drinking water source in the future, not only for their own community, but also for adjacent communities. They may be what we call a giving community or a sending community, where they may be sending their water resources to another community for their use. So there's application, I think, in the future for this type of model to come online, and for towns to think about how to plan for this. If you have a surface water source that could be a potential drinking water source in the future, to start protecting it now and not waiting until you actually have to use it, and then having to, mitigate or go back, back in time to try and, fix problems that are happening around the water source.
Julie?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it, but you've got a question in chat.
Oh, I haven't seen it because I'm sharing my screen. I can't see chat.
If you can't see, well, I can read it to you if you want.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
From Jim, it's from Jim Doggett, and he says, can these be used to protect privately owned water sources and wellheads?
That's a really interesting question, Jim Doggett. Thanks for asking it, because yes, there could be a scenario in the future where communities may be looking for sources on private land, where they may have to, negotiate with private landowners and get protection measures in place, and bring water sources, drinking water sources online that are not municipally owned or controlled, and they may be under private control. So that's a very good question, because yes, that's probably something that could happen in the future. Any other questions, Glenn, from the chat?
Not in the chat, but you've got two hands up, one from Phil Winslow and one from Richard McDermott.
Okay.
Phil was probably first.
Yeah, just something we've run into is that our Conservation Commission is buying land on an annual basis. And one of the things we're doing is that we're asking them to be sure that we have access to water in those lands. And some of that, occasionally that's problematic, but if your towns have conservation and they're buying land, try to get the rights to that water, at least, or water rights as part of the contract.
Yep, that's all up. That is all on the table for the future, as far as like sourcing, future sources of drinking water. A lot of, I would say many is probably a better word. Many New Hampshire communities rely on groundwater for their drinking water sources. And I think Jen will be talking about that in a little bit. Surface waters are a little bit less prevalent. However, when you start to get up into places like in the North Country and in more mountainous types of areas, surface waters are the easiest sources of water. as opposed to drilling really super deep wells. So yeah, that could definitely be part of the future conversations for communities to start planning. Because I think this model, we're hoping what it'll do is like spur some conversation and some discussion about, should we start mapping out our future water supplies? Whether it's for our town or if we're sending it to another community. So that goes to your question, Phil.
Richard.
Our feet, meaning Hampton Falls versus Seabrook, were sort of put to the fire when we were looking for hooking up to their sewer on Route 1 coming north.
Mm-hmm.
We were told, geez, you better watch your aquifer, because Seabrook, if they run out of water, they could demand water, period. No questions asked.
Yeah. Seabrook has a large water well field actually that extends. You may have remembered, it was probably well over a year ago that I talked to you about the Seabrook groundwater reclassification project that we did. And so their actual area of contribution for their water field, their water well field, which are mostly groundwater wells, extends into Hampton Falls, it extends into Kensington and into Southampton. And so the area of contribution to those wells is well beyond their municipal boundaries. And that's another aspect of drinking water that's not part of this model, because we're not talking about groundwater, we're talking about surface water. But yes, there could be a time where communities, face water, shortages. That's like something that, everyone needs a crystal ball to kind of, think about how that would work itself out in the future. But there may be situations where, like I said before, where there'll be communities that will be sending water to other communities to supply them with drinking water. That could be a possibility, but I don't have the answer to that right now. But so I just wanted to, unless there are any more questions, I kind of just wanted to share my screen again, because I have just two more slides to share very quickly. So one is, a plug for our New Hampshire Climate Summit. So 2021, the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group sponsors a climate summit every year. It's happening on May 26th and May 27th. May 26th, I believe it's the afternoon. It's is the agenda, and the 27th is a morning agenda. So it's 2 half days. So registration's open. I think you all received this email probably as part of our last newsletter that we sent out, but I will send it out again. Registration closes next Friday on May 21st. It's a free event, and again, you can register for like half day or both days, whichever you want to do, but both are half days, so it's not like an entire day. And check out the agenda. I will send around, or Tim can send around this slide maybe to people to like remind them of how to register for the event, just so you know.
Julie,
and then the last.
Julie, is it virtual or in person?
It's virtual.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, it's virtual. Yes, and actually this is the quirk of our new cloud system. I didn't include my own slide for my own project here. I'm sorry. So the last slide that wasn't included, I apologize, was the fact that the model buffer, we're holding a workshop on May 24th from 2 to 4 p.m. I will make sure that you all get a copy of that slide as well. It's again a free workshop. We're going to be talking about the model buffer ordinance and going through some of the details. We'll be having some presentations by some state, local, and federal, state and local representatives who have had a lot of experience working with buffers in the past, and just sharing their experiences. And we'll be reviewing some of the more detailed information about the model buffer and the importance from the state perspective, with Pierce Rigrod from the Drinking Water Bureau talking a little bit about why it's an imperative to have this type of model available to communities and to start thinking about forward thinking and future planning for drinking water sources. So I apologize for not having that slide. It was a glitch in saving my file. But you'll get probably the entire presentation at some point, either available online or available through an email, a follow-up email, either me or Tim.
I'll email it out before the end of the week, if that's all right with everybody.
Thanks. I think it was just a glitch from saving it from one place to another. So anyway, May 24, which is a Monday, from 2 to 4 p.m. The model buffer workshop will be happening. It's again a free online event. There'll be 2 hours, and again presentations about the model itself, its relevance to state need, and then presentations from some local perspectives of people who have actually implemented such buffers in the past. So
great. All right. Thanks, Julie. We're good. Just one comment before we turn it over to Jen, just that, people ask about, what do we do? This is an example of something, as Julie said, it may not apply to every community, but I was thinking of Plastow in this case, who is now drawing in water to their downtown from the Merrimack River. Merrimack River is a surface water body that, where the communities that surround it could benefit from this buffer regulation and this model ordinance. So just put it out there just as another example where, membership has, this is something that supporting the RPC helps make these things happen. And it's a perfect example of Plastow probably benefiting from something like this, but not being a member. So,
yeah.
So Jen.
All righty. Hi, everybody.
Oh, speaking of surface water.
I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about groundwater, but we'll talk about both. So for those of you that don't know me, although I believe I know everybody on this call, I'm Jen Rowden, one of the senior planners. I serve as a circuit rider to Northampton, Fremont, and Newton, and occasionally Epping. So I'm going to talk about 2 recent RPC source water protection projects that we have recently wrapped up. We meant to do one of these presentations before COVID hit, and then COVID hit. So these are both funded through DES through a source water protection grant, some of the same source as our model buffer presentation that Julie just gave. But before I get into either project, I just have 2 big things I would like folks to sort of keep in mind is that drinking water protection is always the highest priority whenever we go out to talk to communities. In our regional master plan, it was the highest priority with 94% considering it high priority. Any local master plan survey we do, drinking water always comes up. It usually comes up more than taxes. People understand that we need this for quality of life. So just as a context, people really do support drinking water protection over pretty much any other environmental protection effort. And another thing that the state has actually recognized, this happens to be the Groundwater Protection Act, but since its inception in the early 90s, it has always been recognized by New Hampshire that groundwater, which serves as 60% of New Hampshire's drinking water supply, it's about 70% for the RPC region. Most that surface water is Salem. Actually is a local resource that needs to be protected. Now, sometimes local means a couple of towns, but it is ultimately a local resource, so it has to be protected on the local level. So that's really the reason why we started doing some of these projects, is because we recognize that and trying to help towns. So back in 2019, we set about to do a vulnerability assessment across our region to see what gaps lie within local protections on the town level and then on the regional level between protecting drinking water sources. And specifically also looking at public water systems to see how well they were being protected and what were their vulnerabilities, either from current issues or for future water supplies. The ultimate goal of our project was to try to create some documents and reports and maps that could really assist towns in understanding where they had gaps, so they could help to fill in those gaps, because there's a whole range of ways that you can go about protecting drinking water sources, whether it be surface or ground, public or private. There's a suite of what towns can do, and having towns have a better understanding about where they are compared to their neighbors, understanding what their neighbors are going on and what's actually just going on in their community, because many people are really unfamiliar with where the water sources are, because for the most part, they're hidden under the ground as wells. And what are we actually protecting with different types of regulations? So we did do, as part of this, and that's what you're seeing on the right, is a series of workshops as well. So the first part of our assessment was to do just a general assessment and evaluation of what were towns doing. What level of protection did they have for water generally, but also specifically for drinking water? So we looked at things related to their population, how much conservation land do they have, what's their land use, do they have some health regulations like private well testing? We looked at groundwater protection evaluation, stormwater protection, because stormwater is 90% of the surface water pollution cause in our region, and surface water and groundwater like to talk to each other. It doesn't really matter where the pollution is coming. It will eventually get into the ground and then can get back into the surface water. We also looked to see what kind of surface water protections were there. Wetlands, what were setback, what were septic setbacks, and were there any things like fertilizer restrictions? The result of this is we actually created, for all 27 communities, a series of assessments and recommendations and reports for all the communities that were distributed at our workshops, and also are available online, that give recommendations about, well, where are you compared to everybody else? So we let people know where they were as far as the region, where they stood on some of the general findings that were part of, how protective or not have you chosen to be, either because of circumstance or just because of need. So while I'm not going to go into the immense wording on this slide, there are a huge range of options that municipalities can do to protect water. It can be related to quantity, if you're doing water conservation or outdoor watering restrictions. You can, on the local level, also have health requirements, such as private well testing. You can do regulations through zoning. You can do things through the state that allow restrictions on land use, or do best management practice enforcement. You can also do things that are surface water protections through the state that are restrictions on land and water uses. But you can also do something like adopt a surface water buffer, such as our model ordinance, if that happens to apply to your water source. This is a very busy map. The thing I would like folks to look at when they're looking at this map is all of the little dots. All of those little dots represent public water systems in our region. There are, the wells for public water systems. There are over 900 wells that supply water to the RPC region. About 70% of our region is supplied by groundwater, and 2/3 are supplied by a public water system as it's defined by the state, which is generally anything that is more than 15 service connections, so 15 homes, or more than 25 people for more than 6 months out of the year. So we have lots of small water systems that are like subdivisions or condo associations. We have several big ones, such as Salem, Portsmouth, Exeter, Hampton, as far as really big municipal water systems. We also have some private water systems with Aquarian and the Hampstead Area Water Company in the two sides of our region. The other part of this project was really giving some really detailed comparison with our municipalities. But some of the general findings that we did have is that only about 2/3 of our municipalities have a groundwater protection ordinance. They have something in their zoning that specifically protects groundwater. Now, some that didn't make a big difference because some place like Newcastle has no groundwater. It's a rocky island. There are other places that use a lot of groundwater, even if it's primarily private wells, that simply don't have any land use restrictions that apply over some of their aquifers that serve as public water, or I'm sorry, the aquifers or wellheads. Within our communities, only 5 actually require testing of private wells, and that's pretty much only upon a real estate transfer or a new well siting. It is not a state regulation to require any testing at any point of a property transaction, although it is highly recommended. Most of our towns prohibit high-risk land uses. Those are things like solid waste dumps, hazardous waste dumping, having salt storage that is outdoors, having wastewater lagoons. So those are prohibited in most towns. There are a few exceptions, and some of that is simply because of either it's a very rural town or because of the development patterns within that town. Most towns also do have most towns do have limits on their aquifer recharge areas, so above their stratified drift aquifer, that are good for allowing more infiltration into the aquifer. The general recommendation at the state level is that you try to keep that percentage at 15% or more. I'm sorry, 50% or below for impervious surface coverage. So within each of our municipal assessments, we also evaluated all of those 932 public water system wells for their vulnerability from a variety of different land use attributes. It was a combination of how much and what kind of land use is going around the well. Is that agriculture, because that can provide nitrates entering a water system potentially, impervious land cover because of pollution? Are there things of either known contamination sources or potential contamination sources? And those are inventoried by the state. Potential contamination sources would be things like a gas station or a below ground fuel storage tank, sometimes places that are handling excess amounts of regulated or hazardous substances. So really evaluating within the local vicinity of a well, what is going on the land? And for the most part, wells were fairly well protected in our rural communities and our more urban communities, which are generally served by larger municipal water systems. So they're not getting their water immediately from where their development is. The developed towns that have some element of private wells generally were more susceptible. So this is just an example of the type of information we offer. This happens to be a Exeter water system regarding what was the state ID. Generally, water systems have more than one source or more than one well. What kind of system? What was the source of the system? Was it groundwater or surface water? What kind of well in this case? And what was the ranking of either high, medium, or low of different proximities to different vulnerabilities for that water system? That can actually be used to help you identify, well, maybe there are things that we need to do in relation to a particular well, such as increased land conservation. Maybe we need to not allow some agricultural practices within a certain distance. Or maybe we actually have it pretty well protected and we need to focus our efforts someplace else. So I'm going to actually, just because of time, ask the people hold any questions they may have. I'm not seeing any in the chat or anything at this point. I'm going to move on to our next project, which was our more recent project for trying to help the commission on developing the long-term drinking water plan in New Hampshire, trying to actually assist with that commission, which I know Jackie's going to talk about in just a minute about where they are with that. But our project was to actually develop tools to actually help that commission fulfill some of its legislative charge. So we had 3 main tools that we were developing when we started working on this project, and all were done in coordination with the Stratford Planning Commission. And I'm going to go through them in a little bit of a funny order because I want to show you the dynamic mapper that really is the culmination of the last project I just talked about and then this updated project, because it really is a useful tool for showing a lot of the things that Julie was talking about with the need to protect water from surface that may be serving a community that's in a different location, to towns understanding where they are in relation to each other. But the three things that we created were some dynamic mapping. We did some emerging contaminant source identification for DES. And we also were able to do some local demonstration projects to be used really as stories to be able to tell as we're working on developing this long-term regional drinking water plan. So our emerging contaminant identification, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, emerging contaminants are pollutants that have been identified as posing a hazard to human health, but there may not be yet a full understanding as to what level is going to cause a problem, the sources of that specific contaminant, or how to actually filter or treat it before it enters the drinking water system. In this case, DES was actually asking for our assistance in doing some source identification for PFOAs, which is sort of the biggest emerging contaminant that's been in the headlines. There's been a lot of focus at DES and at the national level to combat those. They're generally associated with industrial processing. So DES asked us to do basically a GIS exercise to use multiple databases to help identify some industries that are generally thought to use materials or chemicals that may result in the release of PFOAs. So the ones that were the predominant ones that we were finding in the list that DES was providing to us as far as industrial codes were textile and paper manufacturing, hair salons, and veterinary practices. In our region, we identified about 120 potential locations using a variety of databases where we reached out to all of those facilities to find out, are you actually releasing anything into the ground? That was sort of the primary cut. None of them responded stating that they were. We got about a 25% response rate, which was honestly a lot higher than we were even anticipating. And we were able to find not a one that was going to be able to serve, that got identified as a potential PFOA discharger for DES to then go and do some further investigation. The lesson that sort of got learned on our side and for DES is really that identifying these sources of potential emerging contaminants is really hard from a distance. It's really knowing what's going on the ground, knowing what the different industries are in your town at the local level that can make that easier to identify. But on the sort of stepping back, it's much easier to prevent those industries going in the future than trying to play catch up and identify them after the fact. So we didn't have a lot to show for when we were doing this identification, but the lesson learned, I think, is really important for DES to know that they need to work on the local level, or we need to work as the RPC on the local level to really help track down some of these emerging contaminants because of specific sources or types of businesses. So the next item was one of our demonstration projects. I actually got to work with the town of Stratham, who were really kind and great to work with about developing a drinking water source protection plan. The town of Stratham has some fairly diverse drinking water. They have a lot of private wells, they have a lot of small public water systems, and they have fairly diverse land use as far as residential, agriculture, some industry, to identify what are some of the items that Stratham could do to actually protect their future drinking water supply, either from current threats. They have industry that can serve as potential contamination sources, but how do they protect their future drinking water supply through either regulations, through education, or the possibility of they may want to consider actually expanding to connect with a larger neighboring municipal system, be that Portsmouth or be that Exeter. So it was really trying to give them some identification and some data to work with and some maps, and then some recommendations for guidance about where they can do some implementation that also meets their larger goals related to they happen to have a recently updated master plan. So where does all of this fit together as far as you want to protect your water? You also have other competing goals and interests that may not always sync up. So how do you work those?
Jen, we have a couple of questions. First one from Phil Winslow.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, Jen, looking at the manufacturing, et cetera, different types, the one thing we found is that car washes have a high preponderance of PFOAs, PFOSs, because what they do is they spray a wax base on cars, and a lot of these have the PFOAs in them. So just something to look at in the future to determine if that's handled by the sewer system, and can it be taken out, or does that get leased at the ground near the car wash?
So with relation to any car washes that may not be actually on a sewer system, to be able to release any water into the ground, they actually have to go through the state to get a groundwater injection permit. So that is actually dictated by the state, and there is testing. In Northampton, they happen to actually have a car wash that got flagged for PFOAs because of some of the state testing requirements. But yes, car washes can certainly be a source, as can firefighting foam is one of the other ones that often gets brought up.
And we have another question from Richard.
Oh, please go ahead, Richard.
Oh, he's muted. I'll ask him to mute. There we go.
Oh.
Sorry, Jen.
There we go.
A few years ago, Stratham and Exeter was putting together some sort of drinking water implementation to tie both towns in. Have they done that at all?
They have not done that. There is the possibility under 101, when the interchange at exit 11 was actually being done through DOT. One of the things the RPC was involved in was negotiating that when that was redone, there is a sleeve underneath there, so that if they ever were to be interconnected, we wouldn't have to go and rip up the road. No, I say the road wouldn't have to get ripped up. So that was brought into it, but at this point, there is not the likelihood it's going to happen anytime soon. Okay. But I will say one thing that people often don't consider when they're thinking of drinking water and source protection is that having a redundancy in your system, meaning you have more than one source or you have a couple of sources, if one were to become contaminated, you can shut it off and you can use another source. So that may be something that Stratham may want to consider in the future. Tim's sort of shaking his head as I think a Stratham resident. But it is a possibility, and there are a number of public water systems up and down, especially Portsmouth Avenue or Route 33 in Stratham, where that might need to become a possibility, depending on sort of what their land use goals are with their commercial zone, especially.
Second statement and question: is there any help for our building inspectors who have to worry about all the not farm animals, but farms with the runoff from the
related to agricultural uses and public water systems, especially, but to some degree, private wells.
Right.
There are some best practices that can be done that really minimize the likelihood of agricultural land use impacting wells. Some of that's just proper manure storage and turning and trying to minimize fertilizers that are being put on the land. So some of it's education, some of it's just sort of practices. As far as help to the building inspectors, that's limited. I mean, there are things that you can at the local level implement, but the best thing really for private well owners especially is to get their wells tested annually. The vast majority of people do not get their wells tested regularly to even know if they have a problem with bacteria or nitrate that may be originating from a farm if that's nearby. Public water systems are required to be tested on a regular basis, so they would start to have an inkling if there was to be an agricultural component potentially.
Yeah, what could eventually happen is you'll never get a chance to speak to your neighbors because they won't talk to you again. if people report each other, believe me. Okay, thanks.
All right, if that's all right for now, I'm going to move on to what I want to say is sort of the flashy part of my demonstration, and I can take very little credit for it. Rob Prine, our GIS manager, did all of the heavy lifting on this web mapper. But what we did is the first topic I was talking about, we did go in and basically digitize all of the mapping we had done when we were doing the vulnerability assessment for all of the wells within communities, but also doing the general municipal protections assessment. Bear with me for 1 second as I switch to my mapper. Okay. So we did include Stratford's region in the mapper, but I'm going to just zoom into us because we all know that RPC is better than SRPC. Tim, please don't tell Jen Suze I said that.
Say a word.
And just for ease, I'm going to turn off all of the water and all of the land conservation. So all you see is really the RPC communities. So one of the first things we looked at is, where is the groundwater? So the yellows and greens and blues that you're seeing right now are all of the USGS mapped aquifers. So these are the groundwater resources. There is groundwater throughout the region. These are the biggest sources of it. So we went and we actually mapped the zoning districts that our communities had that are aquifer protection districts or groundwater protection districts. Those are the brown that you're seeing. So I'm going to click off of the aquifers. So now you're just seeing areas that are actually covered by a groundwater protection district. There is one anomaly, and I apologize to Valerie from Northampton, and that Northampton actually this past March adopted an expansion of their groundwater that covers basically the entire town of Northampton, except for the immediate coast. But what I want to point out is just how much stratified drift aquifer, when I flash that back up, is actually not covered by that brown. So there are a lot of areas of stratified drift aquifer that are not currently being protected. And protections do vary. They are not all universally the same, but generally it is a restriction on the amount of impervious cover and the types of land uses that can be done over these areas. Now the other area of this, I'm going to take off the aquifers. These are still the local groundwater protections. But now I'm going to pull up the wellhead protection areas. These are areas around water systems that are serving a consistent population. Either it's something like a school that's a consistent population, or they are residential uses. So these are areas that these local protections, the brown, often are not covering. In Raymond, as an example, they cover many of their public water system wells. You can sort of see most easily by the circles. And Hampstead, who recently did adopt a groundwater protection ordinance in 2019, they cover their wellhead protection areas for their public water systems, but a lot of our communities really don't. So you may have a wellhead protection area. In this case, it actually is located in Exeter, but its wellhead protection area extends into Newfields. So it's an area where towns understanding what their neighbors' resources are becomes really important. So working together is really important to go across boundary lines, because the groundwater and surface water do not care where your municipal boundaries are. They don't care. So knowing what your neighbor is doing and what you're doing that may influence that water can become really important. Similarly, I'm going to take off groundwater. What you're doing with surface water. So surface waters get a lot more protection in our region and over the state because they're easier to look at. People can see them. These are the areas that we are doing some level of surface water protection. That might be a wetland buffer. It might be a drinking water buffer. It is getting some level of protection, which is going to help any drinking water supply. And in some cases, this is tidal waters that are also getting protected. But we certainly don't cover all of the areas. The other thing I did want to just point out for folks is the areas of our region that are served by water and sewer. So in this case, the purple is water. The green is water and sewer. And the brown is just sewer. I'm going to blame Rob for choosing that as the color. But as you can see, most of our municipalities and areas are not served by large systems. You'll see a few that are sort of these smaller ones. These are effectively neighborhoods. They are subdivisions served by a couple of wells. We have a lot of those, and I'll point to Stratham has several of those. But most are not served by larger systems. And the larger systems, the reason that kind of comes into play is that Portsmouth being served by the Bellamy Reservoir, which happens to be up in this vicinity, Portsmouth can really protect its surface water because they're able to, and in many cases have done some really good conservation efforts of protecting the land around it. That is their source water protection strategy. Simply keep the land uses that are poor away from our water supply. New York City does the same thing. Boston does the same thing. That's harder to do on a local level when we've got these smaller systems. There is less money to invest in some of those. So there's lots of other things I could show you on here. If someone has a burning question, I'm happy to pull it up. But being able to play around and see where are we compared to our neighbors, compared with other people, what are our resources, may help towns choose what they are willing to or can implement as far as source water protection. Are there any questions with?
Oh, sorry, it looks like Julie wants to say something.
Sure, go ahead, Julie.
Hey, Jen, I just wanted to, I think it was a couple of maps ago we were showing that stratified drift aquifer areas.
Yep.
Can you bring that back on the screen? Is that it?
Yep, so these are the stratified drift. They do come from two different studies, which is why they're a little bit off in color, but
okay, so
drift.
I guess my point and my question is that the remaining areas outside of the green and yellow or whatever it's color there, blue, all of those other areas are serviced by groundwater wells, like deep bedrock wells. And so stratified drift aquifer protection is not the be all and end all of groundwater protection. It's probably the most susceptible area because we're talking about shallow, sand and gravel deposits that are like probably less than 100 feet deep. But we're looking at the remaining areas as being bedrock well driven. And so that's the place where I think the big deficit lies for drinking water protection.
Yes, so there are certainly a variety of well types, and Julie's absolutely correct. I will say one other thing to point out with the service areas by some of these municipal systems with pipes. Anybody that is outside of these areas is being serviced by a private well. So the vast majority of our region is land use wise is being serviced by private wells. So the ability to get any sort of interconnection in that source water protection through that redundancy and having different sources, if something becomes a problem, They don't have that option. Their water is what it is on their property. They will not be able to reasonably connect to another water system. So that's why you've heard instances in the news of, DES having to bring in water to contaminated systems. Raymond's had that in the past couple of years. So there are a lot of different things to be done, and it depends on your town and your situation. But effectively, anything you can do to help protect drinking water is going to be a benefit to your town or your community. With that, I think I have thoroughly used my time up. So unless there's any other questions, I think I'll say thank you and turn it on.
Can we get copies of that, Jen?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
We could show some
I'll put
planning
them
board
up there.
people.
So Rich, we have one more. I did want to give, I know we're running a little long on time here. It's getting a little late, but I did ask, at the time I thought it was going to be Jackie Broda to give us a presentation, but is it Pat? Are you going to just talk a little bit?
It's Pat's going to do it because I didn't know what my timing was for today. I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to make the meeting. But I think that what I'd like to make the comment is the two presentations that were made today by Julie, by Jennifer, are so complimentary that it's really important to have that information. And when we add the information that the Drinking Water Commission is collecting, I think we'll have a really strong summary and understanding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat, who has so nicely, graciously offered to present to the work that we've been doing. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to share here, but it's like I said, I don't know if I can do that. Let's see. Share. How about that? Did it work?
Yes.
You did it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think what Jackie was saying is so relevant because what we've been doing in the Drinking Water Commission is I think fits part and parcel with some of what we just saw there. So I guess everybody's familiar with the Long-Term Drinking Water Commission. Let me just it was reestablished about a year and a half ago by HB 495. And it was a follow-on to a commission that had already been in place, and it was just reauthorized. And what we found was, much of the work that was looked at by the original commission, much of it was done. For example, mutual aid between towns for firefighting is pretty well established. So we looked at that. We went through and figured out where we kind of needed to pick up from where they left off. And what we came down to was, one of the big things that we really need to look at the capabilities of, the possibilities of, was some kind of regional planning and regionalization. And as you can see here, the overarching recommendation from the previous commission was, as you can see, there's an ongoing need to fund, develop, and implement regional water supply planning in the Seacoast region. So with that in mind, that was kind of the direction that we headed in. And I'll go through this pretty quickly because I know we're kind of running late here. But so we looked at everything that we stand to gain through regionalization efforts, dealing with problems before they become emergencies. The most efficacious use of available resources, standardized protection for drinking water. I think we just saw the efforts underway for that. And then, the ability to optimize education programs that can, alert people to issues in terms of, for example, drought management that we may or may not be facing here in the immediate future. We recognize that there are challenges, and so we took that into consideration. And some of the things that are also underway. Another one of the infrastructure projects that we've tried to get support from the Groundwater Drinking Water Trust Fund for an infrastructure project through with the reconstruction of the General Sullivan Bridge to connect Portsmouth and Dover. So that kind of thing is ongoing. But we recognize that some of the dissimilarities between the communities involved would have to be taken into consideration. Not everybody deals with the same issues when it comes to water. Some towns deal with surges in tourism and then others with agriculture in the summer. There's always the issue of on the coast and near the coast and the things that vary with that. So we looked at those kinds of things too that we'd have to take into consideration. And one of the things that we did take a look at when we started, I guess this was back last fall, we found that there was a Southern Maine regional project that kind of helped us to think about some of the challenges that we might have to face. And so, again, we recognize that there will be, municipalities that want to make sure that they have control. And the idea of, non-local sources of funding obviously would be needed. So, and then, again, like I said, we look through this Southern Maine project as an example, and just some of the things that, that we could benefit from regionally. For example, large scale projects, like, for example, there isn't any town that's going to be able to take on desalination. That's just too much. But on a regional basis, it might be something that could be considered. Those kind of economies of scale that we could get. So with that in mind, we thought, okay, so where do we start in this process? And and Jackie was kind of the driver on this one and said, we really need to better understand all of our the water systems in the region. And again, I guess I think people understand the commission covers Dover, Portsmouth, Madbury, down through Hampton, Northampton, Exeter, Stratham, Greenland, on down into Seabrook. So we felt like we needed to get an understanding of each of the systems that we're talking about here. So we started a process of having each of the communities present us with an overview of their system, and it with a lot of help from DES in terms of some information that I think similar to what we've seen here tonight. But this is kind of the general guidelines with a little more specifics to each of the kinds of things that we asked them to come and talk to us about. So we're in that process. We're, I think, maybe a third to a half of the way through the communities that we need to hear from. And so I just wanted to quickly show and some examples, just the kind of presentations that we're getting. I won't go through this. Of course, we always start with a drought update from DES, but that's not really news to anyone. So these are the kinds of information, and I think you can see some similarities here. This is examples from the RIE presentation that we had back in February, I think. And so, we had representatives from the Rye Water District as well as DES go through this with us, and so that we could understand how Rye is serviced, where those areas are that are community water systems, where the wells are, where the protections are, where some of the areas that are of concern are. And so we were able to get a good overview from each of the towns. And then DES was able to give us, and this is just an example of, I just selected this slide on manganese because, I think everybody's aware that we're in the process of looking at some levels for manganese because of the concerns with exposure in infants. So those are the kinds of slides. That's the information that we're getting from these, from all of the communities, that will help us then to go forward, to help to work with the communities, to see, where we can kind of pull some things together. And I think all this information that we saw this evening is really helpful for our efforts. And Jackie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think one of the after we have all this information together, we thought we would present it. I think that people, when they think about their water districts, they think about it as an isolated thing. They don't necessarily connect it to other towns and have things that we do affect other communities. So we thought we would put this together, and I think it might be helpful to have some, Julie and Jennifer there too, to put together a groundwater, water quality, water availability presentation, so that people, the people on the coast understand why water is important, and how Rockingham Commission and the legislature fits into this whole thing. Because I think that all the work that you're all doing is important and needs to really be presented to the towns and the people in the towns, so that they understand the value that you bring.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I mean, we've heard so many, like I said, we're probably, I don't know, we're not even halfway through our briefs, but we've heard a number of cases, like we've already talked about Portsmouth getting most of its water from the Bellamy Reservoir in Madbury. And so, what kind of issues come up with that? We just last month had a briefing from Dover, and Dover's got a big concern about some industrial operations happening just over the town line in Barrington, and they're working very closely with them. But that's the kind of thing that we really need to be focusing on, because, like you said, Jennifer, these water resources have no sense of where our town lines are, and so it's really important that we're able to do that, so that we can make the best of what we have.
Patricia, Richard, just a naive question. I'm looking at the diagram here, and you've got X's, circles, then you've got the colors. What are the X's? Wells, I assume?
That's you can see over here in that's the level of the manganese. Okay. And again, this is just a sample that I pulled just to show. We're getting these slides for all kinds of potential contaminants. Yeah. And this is just so you can see here on the legend what those represent.
So, Richard, if I can jump in, I don't know if anyone else has any questions or not, but I guess
are the ladies through? Jackie, Patricia?
Yes, we are. Yeah, I believe we
Yes.
are. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes.
We are.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so no, I just, the reason I brought these three presentations together, and it's just to show that connection. And, I was on the first commission, pretty active with the long-term Seacoast Commission on Drinking Water. I've been on this one as well. I've been in and out in terms of my activity. The challenge I think that we have, and that this commission, both the Drinking Water Commission and the RPC has, is, we can do this work, but it's what needs to be done is bigger than what we can do. As in Jen's presentation, she talked about phase 1 of our regional drinking water plan. We're trying to piece this together $20,000 at a time. It's going to take a long time to do that, and you're going to need a lot more expertise than what we have. But I think we can make a valuable contribution. And just so Jackie and Pat, when the time is right, we can certainly have Jen and Julie come together at one of your meetings and sort of share some of this information, because last thing I think we want to do is have a lot of these communities reinventing what might already be done. In some of the communities that you're going to ask for information won't have information readily available that we can provide. So we just got to make that connection and hopefully, bring a little efficiency to your process.
Absolutely.
And
Go ahead, Barbara. Can you unmute? There we go.
I think that was a great presentation. It's really interesting to see how all these things fit together. As Tim, just following your last remarks, coincidentally, today, I learned about EPA's financing programs under something called Financing Green Infrastructure. And without going into the whole thing, this is funding from EPA that comes to the state through the state revolving fund. And obviously there's a lot of structure and rigmarole with it all. But from what I'm hearing, and the need for basically some support, not 20,000 at a time. This is something that I'd be happy to share the information I have, because I think it's worth the larger, it's made for the larger picture you're describing.
I'd love to get that information, Barbara. So just send it our way.
You can I'll pass it through, Barbara.
Could I do it with a phone call? Because otherwise I'm gonna have to type it all out. And I can give you the links as to where you can find the information. Would that be okay?
Tim?
Yeah, that should be fine, guys. I'm having some terrible internet connectivity issues. I don't know if anyone else is, but I'm losing you guys periodically. Must be the late hour. I'm not sure.
Tim, it's loud and clear for me, so I think everyone else is good.
Yeah, it's probably just on my end that I'm losing you guys. I'm not hearing all the dialogue right now, so that's why my video is off. But anyway, Barbara, if anything you want to share with the group, I can just pass it through to me. I know I'll make sure we get it out to the commission, both the Drinking Water Commission and the RPC folks.
Okay, then you got to give me a little time, so I will put it together in an email.
Absolutely. All right.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Oh, Richard, you're muted. There we go.
My comment was, we're probably through, and I have not heard the word, but it's way past 1 o'clock.
All right.
I can't hear the word. We're adjourned.
I make a
You
motion
said
to
it.
adjourn.
I think you can call it,
can do
Richard. We don't have to do a motion to adjourn or anything
I
like
didn't
that.
make a motion. I just said adjourned.
Oh, okay.
Good night.
Okay,
Good night,
bye-bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.